She was just a waitress. He was a ruthless billionaire. But one rainy night, a simple act of kindness changed everything. When Jasmine Brooks gave a shivering boy in a wheelchair a warm meal, she had no idea he was Ethan Hayes, the son of one of the most powerful men in the city. Suddenly, she's pulled into a world of wealth, betrayal, and power plays. Framed for a crime she didn't commit, Jasmine must fight back. And she won't just survive. She'll rise. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this. The rain came down in relentless sheets, turning the cracked pavement into a shimmering, uneven mess. The city never truly slept, but on nights like this, it felt like the world had shrunk, leaving only the glow of flickering neon signs and the hush of water slapping against asphalt. Inside, a tiny 24-hour diner on the corner of Belmont Avenue, Jasmine Brooks wiped down the counter, exhaustion settling deep in her bones after a grueling 12-hour shift. The place was supposed to be closing, but some old instinct she couldn't shake, made her glance toward the window one last time. That was when she saw him. A small figure sat hunched over in a wheelchair just beyond the diner's glow, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, a too-thin coat barely shielding him from the biting wind. His fingers gripped the edges of a tattered blanket, but it was clear it did little against the cold. He wasn't just waiting, he was enduring. Jasmine frowned, setting her rag down before pushing open the door. "Hey, sweetheart," she called gently, crouching beside him. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The boy flinched at first, his blue eyes wide, uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to answer. "I'm waiting for my dad," he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the rain. Jasmine followed his gaze up and down the street. Nothing. No one. Just the dim glow of a pawn shop's cash or gold sign blinking across the road and the occasional hiss of tires cutting through puddles. "Where is he?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. The boy only shrugged, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. Jasmine exhaled slowly. She had seen too many nights like this. Kids left waiting for someone who wasn't coming. She didn't know this boy, didn't know his story. But she knew this feeling. "Well, you can't stay out here, not in this mess." She offered him a warm smile. "Come inside with me, okay? It's warm, and I've got something special just for you." The boy hesitated, but then, as if deciding she was safe, he gave a small nod. "All right then." Jasmine gently took hold of the wheelchair's handles and pushed him inside, the warmth of the diner hitting them immediately, wrapping around them like a thick blanket. The scent of buttered toast and burnt coffee lingered in the air, familiar and safe. She guided him toward a booth near the radiator, draping a fresh towel over his shoulders, before crouching down to meet his eyes. "I'm Jasmine," she said, flashing a grin. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The boy sniffled, fingers curling around the blanket. "Ethan," he murmured. Jasmine nodded approvingly.
"That's a strong name. You hungry?"
He gave a hesitant nod. That was all the answer she needed. She moved toward the kitchen, pulling out a fresh loaf of sourdough and slicing it with practiced ease. A few minutes later, she set a steaming plate in front of him. Golden, crisp grilled cheese with a bowl of tomato soup on the side. Her grandmother had always said this meal could fix almost anything. "This one's on me," she said, tucking a napkin into his lap. Ethan took a bite, and his blue eyes widened as the cheese stretched in long, gooey strings. "This is the best thing I've ever had," he murmured, wonder in his voice. Jasmine chuckled, watching as he devoured the sandwich. "Good food makes everything better," she said lightly. "But inside, She felt a familiar ache, the kind that came when she saw someone too young, too small, carrying the weight of the world. What she didn't know was that someone was watching. Across the street, a sleek black car sat idle in the shadows, its tinted windows reflecting the diner's neon glow. Inside, Nick Hayes watched in silence, his sharp gray eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before him. At 44, Nick was a man who had built his empire on control, precision, ruthlessness. Hayes Technologies was the beating heart of the city's tech industry, a billion-dollar machine that ran on efficiency, not sentiment. And Nick had spent years ensuring that nothing, no person, no emotion, no weakness, interfered with that. Yet here he was, watching, listening, thinking. Ethan was his son. And that woman, the waitress in a cheap apron in a rundown diner, was feeding his son for free. Nick's jaw tightened. He had been delayed. An urgent call with investors in Japan. He had told Ethan to wait by the diner for just a few minutes. He hadn't expected this. He reached for his phone, dialing quickly. "Nora," he said, when his assistant picked up. "Get down to Belmont Diner. No suits, no heels. I need you there in 20 minutes. A pause. "Sir?" Nick's grip on the phone tightened. "Find out everything you can about the woman who just fed my son." And then he hung up. Inside the diner, Ethan was laughing for the first time all night, swinging his legs under the table, soup stains on his chin. Across the street, Nick Hayes watched, his expression unreadable, his mind already working, already calculating. Because he didn't believe in kindness. He believed in debts. And whether she realized it or not, Jasmine Brooks had just put him in hers. Jasmine trudged home that night, her sneakers soaked from the rain, the dampness clinging to her skin like an unwelcome weight. The diner's measly tip sat light in her pocket, barely enough for rent, let alone groceries. But it wasn't the money that weighed on her. It was the feeling in her chest, the gnawing unease that something about tonight wasn't right. She had seen it in Ethan's hesitant eyes, in the too smooth way that woman had spoken when she come to take him. His aunt. That's what she had claimed to be. But Jasmine knew a lie when she heard one, and she had heard plenty in her life. Still, she had let him go. She sighed, rubbing a tired hand over her face as she climbed the narrow stairwell to her one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The building smelled of old carpet and cigarette smoke, the walls thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television blaring some late-night crime show 3 doors down. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She had barely closed the door behind her when there was a knock. Jasmine stiffened. No one came by at this hour. Her stomach tightened as she stepped toward the door, pressing her eye to the peephole. And her breath caught. A man stood on the other side, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a ridiculously expensive black coat that looked like it cost more than her entire rent. His face was sharp, too precise, like it had been carved out of stone, but it was his eyes that unsettled her. Cold, calculating, as if he had already taken her apart in his mind before she had even opened the door. She didn't open it. "Who is it?" A pause. Then a voice. Low, controlled. Too controlled. Nick Hayes. The name meant nothing to her. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her hand firmly on the lock. Another pause. Then, to talk. Her gut screamed hell no, but curiosity was a stubborn thing. Slowly, she unlatched the door, opening it just enough to see his face clearly. Up close, he looked even more out of place in her world. Everything about him, from the crisp cut of his coat to the spotless shoes that had somehow avoided the city's grime, screamed money, power, control. Jasmine crossed her arms.
I don't know you.
His gaze didn't waver. "No, but you know my son." Her stomach dropped. "Ethan." She straightened, her grip tightening on the doorframe.
You're his father.
A nod, barely perceptible. "I was across the street last night." Her pulse skipped. "You were watching?" "I was." Jasmine exhaled slowly, forcing down the discomfort crawling up her spine. "So what? You here to complain that I fed your kid?" Nick's gaze flickered. Unreadable. No, a beat. "I don't believe in charity." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Wow, that's a hell of a way to say thank you." "I do believe in debts." Before she could react, he reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, placing it on the rickety table just inside her apartment. Jasmine didn't move, her eyes flicking between him and the envelope. "What is that?" "A job offer." She blinked. What?" Nick tilted his head slightly, as if gauging just how much patience he was willing to grant her. "A job. At Hayes Technologies, 6 figures, benefits, the works." Jasmine let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You think I want to work for some rich white man who thinks handing out a check makes us even?" Nick didn't flinch. "I don't think you want charity, Jasmine. That's why I'm not offering it." The sound of her name in his mouth made something tighten in her chest. She folded her arms, eyeing him warily. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." His voice was steady, unshakable. "Like a man who never asked, only decided. I know you gave my son food without expecting anything in return. I know you didn't treat him like an inconvenience. I know that's rare." She swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way his words hit something deep in her ribs. Her eyes flickered back to the envelope. Thick. Expensive. The kind of paper that had weight. The kind that meant whatever was inside wasn't small. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Never owe these people anything, baby. You know they don't give without taking." Her jaw clenched. "And what exactly would I be doing at Hayes Technologies? Making coffee?" For the first time, something almost like amusement flickered across Nick's face. "Almost." "No," he said. "You'd be working directly with me. Handling negotiations. Public relations." He paused. "You're good with people. I need someone like that." Jasmine snorted. "You don't need me. You've got a company full of Ivy League grads who'd slit each other's throats for a job like that." Nick's expression finally shifted, just slightly. "That's exactly why I don't trust them." The words hung between them, heavy, waiting. Jasmine could feel the weight of his offer pressing against her, curling around the edges of her pride, her exhaustion, her stubborn refusal to be bought. But 6 figures. 6 figures meant no more late rent. No more living paycheck to paycheck. No more nights wondering how she'd stretch her last $20. Her throat tightened. She hated that she was considering it. She looked up at him. "Why me?" Nick held her gaze, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes. "Because you saw my son," he said quietly. "Not my money. Not my name. You saw him." Jasmine's fingers curled. She looked at the envelope one last time. Then, slowly, she picked it up. "I'll think about it," she murmured. Nick studied her for a long moment. Then he gave a curt nod. "Good. Good." And without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway, his presence lingering long after he was gone. Jasmine stood there, staring at the envelope in her hands. She already knew.
She wasn't just thinking about it.
She was going to say yes. Jasmine stepped into the towering glass building of Hayes Technologies, her thrift store blazer stiff against her shoulders, her heels, bought secondhand but polished to perfection, clicking against the marble floor. Everything here gleamed. The kind of shine that smelled like money, like power, like people who had never once worried about overdraft fees or stretching a paycheck until the next shift. The moment she crossed the lobby, she felt eyes snap toward her. Not curiosity. Calculation. People weren't just looking. They were assessing. She squared her shoulders. Let them watch. At the front desk, a young woman with red lipstick and a headset barely looked up from her monitor. Name? Jasmine Brooks. Her fingers flew over the keyboard. Ah. You're expected on the top floor. Mr. Hayes is waiting. She handed Jasmine a sleek black visitor's badge. Jasmine took it, exhaling slowly before stepping into the elevator. The ride up felt like rising into another world. The numbers ticked higher, and with each floor, she felt the weight of something unspoken press harder against her ribs. When the doors slid open, a different kind of silence greeted her, the kind laced with importance. Power. The receptionist here, a woman in a sharp gray suit, barely spared her a glance before motioning toward the frosted glass doors at the end of the hall. He's inside. Jasmine pushed through, her grip tightening around the strap of her bag. Nick Hayes sat behind a ridiculously sleek desk, floor-to-ceiling windows framing him against the city skyline. He didn't look up, just gestured toward the chair across from him. You're late. Jasmine arched a brow.
By 2 minutes.
Nick finally looked at her. That's 2 minutes. I don't get back. Jasmine let out a breath, shaking her head. She had barely been here 5 seconds, and he was already starting. Look, she said, dropping into the chair. You want me here or not? Nick leaned back, studying her. That remains to be seen. Before she could fire back, a glass door behind her opened. Miranda Cole walked in. Jasmine recognized her immediately. The woman from the diner. The one who had picked up Ethan. The one who had lied about being his aunt. She was dressed differently now. All business. Her fitted black dress cutting a silhouette of precise authority. She held a tablet in one hand, her expression unreadable. Miranda's gaze flickered over Jasmine, a split-second evaluation. Jasmine saw it for what it was, measuring her. Jasmine just smiled. Oh, we're doing last names? All right. Good to see you again, Miss Cole. Something flickered in Miranda's eyes. Just for a second, before she turned to Nick. I've prepared the reports for the Orion Group negotiations, she said, handing him the tablet. Would you like me to brief her on company protocols? Nick didn't even glance up. No, I will. Jasmine wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a warning. Miranda only nodded. But before she turned to leave, she hesitated just slightly at the door, her gaze landing on Jasmine once more. Good luck, she murmured. Jasmine tilted her head. The way she said it didn't sound like encouragement. It sounded like a warning. Jasmine barely had time to process it before Nick was already moving. Let's get something straight, he said, flipping through the reports. This isn't a test run. You're here because I need results. If you can't deliver, you're gone. Jasmine leaned back, crossing her arms.
So, no pressure then.
Nick didn't even blink. None. She exhaled through her nose. All right. She could handle this. Nick slid a file across the desk. Orion Group, he said. They want to push through a contract that will cut labor costs by outsourcing jobs overseas. That means layoffs. Thousands. Jasmine skimmed the file, her stomach twisting. This was corporate greed at its finest. She looked up. And you want me to do what? Nick's gaze didn't waver. I want you to do what you do best. A pause. Read people. Jasmine sat back. Let me get this straight. Nick's expression didn't change. No, a beat. I brought you in because I think you understand something they don't. She narrowed her eyes. And what's that? He leaned forward slightly. That people who have nothing to lose fight the hardest. The words hit her like a punch to the ribs, because she knew exactly what he meant. Jasmine stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled, shaking her head. You know, she muttered, you talk in riddles a lot for someone who runs a tech empire. For the first time, the corner of his mouth almost twitched. Almost. And then, just like that, the moment was gone. Meetings at noon, he said, standing. Try not to be late. Jasmine rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She had a job to do. And if this was the world she had just stepped into, she was damn well gonna win. Jasmine had been at Hayes Technologies for exactly 2 weeks when she realized she was in a war she hadn't signed up for. It wasn't the late nights or the endless stacks of reports that tipped her off. It wasn't even the suffocating air of wealth and power that coated every inch of this place like a second skin. It was the way people watched her. Like she was a problem waiting to be solved. Or better yet, eliminated. She felt it in the meetings where senior executives barely acknowledged her existence, in the polite but razor-sharp smiles from Miranda Cole, and the carefully calculated glances exchanged whenever she spoke. Jasmine knew that look. She'd seen it before. Back when she was waiting tables and certain customers would glance at her name tag like they were debating whether or not to correct her existence. She had learned, a long time ago, how to hold her ground in spaces that didn't think she belonged. And she wasn't about to start folding now. So when Jonathan Pierce, the senior executive in charge of acquisitions, barely glanced up from his papers during meeting and said, I don't see why she needs to be in this discussion, Jasmine just smiled. Nick, seated at the head of the long gleaming table, didn't even look at him when he answered. Because I said so. Jonathan stiffened slightly, the room going quiet. Jasmine could feel the tension, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who the hell was she? And why did Nick Hayes care? Jonathan cleared his throat, straightening his tie. Of course, Nick. Just wondering why we're adding unnecessary personnel to sensitive negotiations. Jasmine kept her expression neutral, but her nails pressed into her palm beneath the table. Nick finally did look up, his gaze flat, unreadable. Jonathan, he said evenly, do I strike you as the kind of man who wastes time on unnecessary personnel? Jonathan's mouth opened, then closed. No, he muttered. Nick nodded, his attention already moving on. Jasmine didn't miss the way Jonathan's jaw tightened, the way he didn't look at her again for the rest of the meeting. But she could feel it. She had just made an enemy. That night she was the last one in the office. Nick had long since disappeared into whatever billion-dollar world he lived in after business hours, and even Miranda had left, offering a simple, don't stay too late, as she passed Jasmine's desk. Jasmine had just finished scanning the last of her notes when her email dinged. She almost ignored it, but something about the subject line made her pause. Confidential, not for external distribution. Her brows furrowed as she clicked it open. Inside was an attachment, a classified internal financial report detailing a planned merger that hadn't been announced yet. Jasmine's stomach twisted. This wasn't meant for her. But her name was on the forwarded email. Her pulse quickened. Someone wanted it to look like she had this information. And that meant one thing. Someone was setting her up. Jasmine shot out of her chair, grabbing her phone and dialing the only person she could think of. Miranda answered on the second ring. "Did you know I'd be getting an email with sensitive financial documents tonight? Or is that just a fun little surprise?" A pause. Then, "Shit," Jasmine swallowed. "Yeah, that's what I thought." "I'm on my way back," Miranda said. 15 minutes later, Miranda was standing over Jasmine's desk, arms crossed, expression tighter than usual. "This isn't just a mistake," she muttered. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Jasmine exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "I was an easy target." Miranda didn't argue. Jasmine let out a humorless laugh. The outsider. The one who doesn't have powerful friends in this place. Miranda hesitated. Then, to Jasmine's surprise, she sighed. "I won't lie to you," she said. "If this gets out before we find out who actually leaked that file, you're the one who's going to take the fall." Jasmine swallowed hard. She already knew that. A black woman in a world like this didn't get the benefit of the doubt. She was guilty the second they said she was. Her jaw clenched. "So what do we do?" Miranda looked at her, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. Then, for the first time since Jasmine met her, she smiled. "We fight back." Jasmine barely slept that night. She had been in tight spots before. Landlords hiking up rent with no notice, bills stacking higher than her paycheck, customers at the diner trying to get a free meal by claiming she got their order wrong. But this was different. This wasn't just about keeping her job. This was about staying ahead of the knife someone was already pressing against her back. By the time the sun rose, she had gone through the forwarded email a dozen times, analyzing every detail, every timestamp, every possible clue. She was being framed. And whoever was behind it was careful. Too careful. By the time she walked into the office, Miranda was already waiting for her outside Nick's office, arms crossed, coffee in one hand, tablet in the other. "Did you sleep?" Miranda asked, eyeing her. Jasmine let out a dry laugh. "Did you?" Miranda smirked. "Fair enough." Then, she tilted her head toward the door. Jasmine took a steadying breath before stepping inside. Nick was standing behind his desk, looking out the massive glass windows. The morning sunlight cut sharp angles across his face, but his expression was unreadable. He didn't turn when she entered. "Tell me I wasn't wrong," he said, his voice calm. Too calm. Jasmine stepped forward, tossing the printed email onto his desk. "This isn't me." Nick finally turned, gray eyes locking onto hers. "I want to believe that." Jasmine felt something cold and sharp twist in her gut. "You want to?" she echoed. Nick leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "This is a serious leak, Jasmine. Millions in exposure. Stock drops. Investigations. You understand how bad this is." Jasmine's jaw clenched. "I understand perfectly." She stepped closer, her voice steady, sharp. "I also understand that whoever did this knows exactly what they're doing. I was the easy target, right? The outsider, the black woman with too much confidence. Who's going to believe me over some executive who's been here for 10 years? Nick didn't flinch. But he didn't disagree either. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, finally, he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "We find the real leak," he said. Jasmine blinked. "We..." Not you. Not me. We. She hadn't realized just how much tension she'd been holding until that moment. She nodded, swallowing past the tightness in her throat. Good. Good. Nick turned to Miranda.
Why we know so far?
Miranda tapped on her tablet, flipping it toward them. The email was routed through an external server. Someone covered their tracks well, but I'm running a full trace now. It'll take time. Nick's jaw tightened. We don't have time. Jasmine folded her arms. Then we make them slip up. Nick raised a brow. Do you propose we do that? Jasmine smirked. We give them something else to leak. Miranda's lips curved just slightly. I like the way you think. Nick nodded slowly, considering. Fine, he said. But if we do this, we do it my way. Controlled, calculated. Jasmine rolled her eyes. Right, because you're so emotionally impulsive. Miranda snorted. Nick shot her a look. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Miranda only sipped her coffee. A little. Jasmine shook her head, but for the first time since this whole mess started, she felt like she was back in control. Whoever set her up thought she'd just sit back and let them destroy her. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. Jasmine sat across from Miranda in one of the private conference rooms, the dim glow of the monitor casting sharp shadows across the table. The office had cleared out for the night, leaving them alone in a sea of silent glass walls and dimmed city lights. She drummed her fingers against the table. You're sure this will work? Miranda didn't look up from her tablet. If they're as careful as we think they are, they won't be able to resist checking. Jasmine exhaled, leaning back. The plan was simple, at least in theory. They had crafted a fake internal document, one that looked valuable but would ultimately lead nowhere. A well-placed whisper in the right inbox, a tiny digital breadcrumb, just begging to be followed. If the real mole took the bait, they'd leave a trace. And then they'd bury them. All right, Jasmine murmured, rubbing her temples. Now we wait. But she hated waiting. She had never been the kind of person to sit back while someone else dictated the game. Not then. Not now. The bait was taken faster than expected. Less than 24 hours later, the fake document had been forwarded outside the company's servers, just like they hoped. Jasmine and Miranda sat side by side in Nick's office, watching as he scrolled through the report Miranda had compiled. He was silent, his expression unreadable, but Jasmine could see the tightness in his jaw. Jonathan Pierce, Miranda confirmed, flipping her tablet toward them. The leak was traced to his assistant's credentials, but cross-referencing logins, timestamps, and access points. He's the one who pulled the file. Jasmine's stomach twisted, but she wasn't surprised. She had felt it in the way he looked at her, the way he dismissed her presence from day one. Nick leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together. And we're sure about this? Miranda nodded, beyond a doubt. Jasmine exhaled. Then, let's take him down. Nick tapped his fingers once against the desk before standing. We do this carefully, legally. We bring it to the board before he has a chance to cover his tracks. Jasmine watched him for a moment. This was personal for him, too. Not because of her, but because someone had dared to betray him. She didn't care what his reasons were, as long as Jonathan Pierce paid for trying to ruin her. The next morning, Jonathan Pierce walked into the trap without even realizing it. Jasmine and Nick sat in the executive conference room, the city skyline stretching behind them. The board members filled the long table, some curious, some impatient. Jonathan strode in with the confidence of a man who thought he had already won. He barely glanced at Jasmine. She almost smiled. Nick didn't waste time. The issue at hand, he said, voice sharp. Final is a data leak that compromised internal financial reports. He slid a folder across the table. "And we've traced it directly back to you, Jonathan." The silence was immediate. Jonathan blinked, then scoffed, shaking his head. "That's ridiculous." Jasmine didn't blink. "Is it?" She slid another folder toward him. This one filled with timed access logs, forwarded emails, and Logan traces. "Because according to the system," she continued smoothly, "you accessed the file in question at 10:47 p.m. 2 nights ago. And 2 hours later, it was leaked." Jonathan's face paled. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Panic. He let out a forced laugh. "This is absurd. Anyone could—" Nick cut him off. "Your assistant's login was used, but cross-referencing timestamps and building access records. You were the only one in the office at that time." Jonathan's mouth opened, then closed. The boardroom was dead silent. Nick exhaled, adjusting his cuffs before looking Jonathan dead in the eye. "You thought you could set Jasmine up," he said, voice cold, absolute. "But you made one mistake." Jonathan swallowed. "And what's that?" Nick's lips curled just slightly. "You underestimated her." Jonathan Pierce was escorted out of Hayes Technologies before lunch. By security and Jasmine? She sat at her desk, watching the city through the glass walls, her heart still pounding. She had won. But she wasn't done yet. Jasmine barely had time to let the victory sink in before she realized something was still off. Jonathan Pierce had been careful, too careful to leave such obvious evidence behind, unless he was desperate or unless he wasn't working alone. She sat in her office, staring at the city beyond the floor, to ceiling windows, the weight of the morning's events still pressing against her ribs. Jonathan was gone. Fired. Ruined. But it had been too easy. Jasmine had spent her whole life fighting battles she never asked for, and she knew one thing better than anything else. When something felt too simple, it usually meant the real fight hadn't even started yet. A knock on the glass door made her turn. Nick stood there, watching her. She didn't invite him in. He came in anyway. He dropped a thick folder onto her desk, his expression unreadable. "You were right." Jasmine arched a brow. "I usually am." Nick didn't even smirk. That's how she knew it was serious. She flipped open the folder. Inside were financial records, email logs, correspondences. Only this time, the name attached wasn't Jonathan Pierce. It was someone higher. Someone with real power. Her stomach twisted. "No." Nick exhaled. "Yes." She shut the folder, pushing it away. "Tell me you're kidding." Nick sat on the edge of her desk, crossing his arms. "Do I look like I make jokes?" She pinched the bridge of her nose. "So you're telling me that Jonathan wasn't just covering his own ass. Someone higher up helped him." Nick nodded. Jasmine's mind raced. She had known Jonathan had connections, but she thought his downfall would be the end of it. Instead, it was just the beginning. She looked up. "Who else knows about this?" Nick hesitated for half a second. Then, "Just you and me." Jasmine's fingers curled against the desk. She knew what that meant. This wasn't a problem they could handle publicly. Not yet. She exhaled, leaning back. "So, what's the move?" Nick met her gaze. "We do what we do best." Jasmine smirked. "We fight back." Nick's lips twitched. Almost a smile, but not quite. Then, just like that, the moment was gone. And the real war began. Jasmine knew how to fight battles, but this wasn't a battle. This was a war. And the enemy was still hidden in the shadows. She sat across from Nick in his office, the thick folder of evidence still sitting between them, untouched for the last 10 minutes. It felt like an open wound neither of them wanted to poke at, because poking at it meant acknowledging that this wasn't over. Jonathan Pierce had been a pawn. And if someone with real power had been protecting him, that meant the next move had to be flawless. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Tell me you have a plan." Nick exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I always have a plan." She arched a brow. "Yeah, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like someone inside your company is trying to burn it down from the inside. And if they were smart enough to cover for Jonathan, they sure as hell won't make the same mistakes twice." Nick's gray eyes flickered with something sharp. Calculation, irritation, maybe even respect. "I never said it would be easy." Jasmine let out a dry laugh. "That's good, because easy isn't something I believe in." Nick smirked. "Then you'll fit in just fine." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. "So, what's the play?" she asked, tapping the folder. "We can't just sit on this." Nick nodded. "We won't. But we also can't go in blind." He gestured toward the folder. "This is proof that Jonathan had help, but it's not enough to prove who gave the order." Jasmine's stomach twisted. He was right. They had pieces of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. She exhaled. "So we make them show their hand." Nick nodded, his gaze sharp. "We force them to make a move." Jasmine smirked. "And when they do—" Nick leaned forward, his voice dropping to something low, deadly. "We take them down." That night, Jasmine sat in her apartment, staring at the ceiling. The city buzzed outside, the sounds of honking cars and distant sirens filling the air. She should have been exhausted. She was exhausted. But her mind wouldn't stop racing. Because this wasn't just about saving her job anymore. This was about finding out who was pulling the strings. And whoever they were, they had made one mistake. They thought she would fold. They thought she was just another temporary obstacle they could move out of the way. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Jasmine closed her eyes, exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. And she was ready. Jasmine arrived at Hayes Technologies the next morning with a plan. She wasn't just going to sit back and wait for their invisible enemy to make a move. She was going to force their hand. Nick was already waiting in his office, sleeves rolled up, the faintest shadows under his eyes. He looked like he had spent the night calculating every possible outcome, trying to stay 3 steps ahead of a threat he couldn't yet see. Good, because Jasmine had done the same. She dropped a USB drive onto his desk. "This," she said, "is how we shake the tree." Nick picked it up, turning it between his fingers.
And what exactly am I looking at?
"A new internal report," she said. "Or at least, that's what they'll think." Nick arched a brow. "Go on." Jasmine leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "It's a completely fabricated financial projection. A document suggesting that we're about to pull out of a major deal. Something big enough that anyone who has a stake in our failure will panic." Nick's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You want to see who flinches first?" "Exactly." Jasmine nodded. "If our mole still has eyes inside, they'll see this and have to decide. Do they report it? Do they report it? Do they stay quiet? Do they try to manipulate the situation?" She tilted her head. "No matter what they do, we'll be watching." Nick exhaled slowly, then, finally, smirked. "I knew I hired you for a reason." Jasmine rolled her eyes. "I told you that already." Nick shook his head, but he was already plugging in the USB. "Let's get to work." By noon, the bait was in the system. By 3, they had their first bite. Miranda strode into Nick's office, tablet in hand, her usual cold confidence replaced with something tighter. "We have movement," she said, flipping the screen toward them. Jasmine and Nick both leaned in. And there it was. The fake financial report had been accessed and forwarded externally. "Do we have a name?" Nick asked. Miranda nodded. "It was routed through a proxy server, but it is tracing the real IP now. We'll have it soon." Jasmine could feel her pulse thrumming in her ears. This was it. Whoever had been pulling the strings, whoever had framed her, protected Jonathan, tried to sabotage the company from within. They had just taken the bait. And soon, their name would be right in front of her. Nick leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Jasmine folded her arms, gaze steady. "Checkmate," she murmured. Nick smirked. "Not yet. But soon." The moment the name appeared on Miranda's screen, the air in Nick's office shifted. Jasmine didn't breathe. She just stared at the name, the one name she hadn't expected, but somehow it made perfect sense. Gregory Langston, the company's chief operating officer. Nick's second in command. A man who had spent 2 decades standing at Nick's right hand, a fixture in Hayes Technologies for longer than she had been out of college. And he had been the one pulling the strings all along. Nick exhaled slowly, fingers pressed together like he was processing, calculating, deciding. "He's been with me since the beginning," he muttered, almost to himself. "I trusted him." Jasmine leaned forward, her voice steady. "And he used that trust against you." Nick didn't flinch, but something in his jaw ticked. Miranda sighed, dropping into a chair. "Honestly, I'm not surprised." She glanced at Nick. "You don't do sentiment, but you've always had a blind spot for loyalty." Nick's gaze flicked toward her, sharp. "I don't have blind spots." Miranda arched a brow. Jasmine folded her arms. "Yeah, then explain how the guy standing at your shoulder was actively working to undermine you." Nick exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "We don't move until we have concrete proof." Miranda gestured to her screen. "We have direct trace to his credentials." "That's not enough," Nick said. "We need leverage." Jasmine smirked. "Then let's get some." That night, Jasmine sat in the back of a high-end cocktail lounge. A glass of whiskey in front of her, eyes locked on the man sitting 2 booths away. Gregory Langston. He looked comfortable, relaxed, like a man who thought he had already won. He had no idea he was being watched. Jasmine had learned a long time ago that people showed their true selves when they thought no one was looking. And tonight, she was going to make him slip. She waited until he was 2 drinks deep before she moved. Slipping into the seat across from him, she flashed a slow smile. "Evening, Mr. Langston." He blinked at her, surprised, but only for a second. Then his expression smoothed into something too polished. "Miss Brooks," he said, swirling his drink. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Jasmine tilted her head. "You tell me." Langston smirked. "I wasn't expecting company tonight." "No," Jasmine arched a brow, "because I get the feeling you've been expecting quite a bit." Langston leaned back, steadying her. "Is that so?" Jasmine folded her arms on the table. "Jonathan Pierce. The data leaks. The little chess game you've been playing from the inside." She leaned in. "You were sloppy, Greg." His smirk faltered. For 1 second. Then it was back, smooth as ever. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jasmine chuckled, shaking her head. "You really should give me more credit." Langston swirled his glass, gaze flicking toward her. "And if I don't?" Jasmine smiled. "Then, I guess you'll have to explain to Nick Hayes why your name is all over a financial leak that nearly cost this company millions." That did it. The smirk vanished. His fingers tightened around the glass. Jasmine exhaled, sitting back. See, Gregory, the thing about power, it shifts. And right now, it's shifting away from you. He said nothing, just watched her. Jasmine stood, tossing a few bills onto the table. I'd start thinking about my next move if I were you. Then she walked away, leaving him sitting there, knowing his king was about to fall. The boardroom was silent. Jasmine stood near the far end of the long, gleaming table, hands steady, heart pounding. Gregory Langston sat at the opposite end, his face an unreadable mask of control. But Jasmine had seen it crack the night before. The tightening of his jaw, the momentary flicker of panic when he realized his game was over. Now, all that was left was checkmate. Nick sat at the head of the table, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. "Gregory," he said, voice calm, cold, deadly. "Do you know why you're here?" Langston smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Enlighten me." Jasmine slid a folder across the table. "These are copies of every file you leaked, every unauthorized transaction, every email routed through a proxy server that traced back to you." Langston didn't look at it, but his fingers twitched. Nick's gray eyes locked onto him. "You've been with me for a long time." A pause. "And you've been stealing from me just as long." Langston exhaled, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake." "No," Jasmine said. "You did." She tapped the folder. "You got cocky. Thought you could hide behind people like Jonathan Pierce. Thought no one would ever question the man standing next to Nick Hayes." She leaned forward. "But you forgot one thing." Langston's jaw ticked.
And what's that?
Jasmine smiled. "I don't scare easy." Nick exhaled, adjusting his cuffs. "Your resignation is already written," he said, sliding another folder across the table. "You sign it now. You leave quietly, no press, no scandal, no lawsuits." Langston let out a slow, humorless laugh. "And if I don't?" Nick smiled. "It wasn't friendly. Then I make sure every executive in this city knows exactly who you are. Every shady deal. Every lie. You won't work in this industry again." Langston stared at him. Jasmine could see the moment he realized he'd lost. His fingers curled into a fist. Then, slowly, he reached for the pen. The scratch of ink against paper was the sweetest sound Jasmine had ever heard. 2 weeks later, Jasmine stood next to Nick at Ethan's school graduation. The boy grinned up at her, clutching his diploma like it was the greatest prize in the world. "I told you I'd make it," he said, chest puffed out. Jasmine laughed, ruffling his hair. Never doubted it for a second. Nick watched them, his usual cool exterior softened just slightly. "You did good, Brooks," he murmured. Jasmine smirked. "Damn right I did." Ethan glanced between them, eyes bright. "Are you guys gonna hug or something?" Nick sighed. "Absolutely not." Jasmine rolled her eyes. "God, no." Ethan just grinned. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt like she had built something real. Something that mattered. And she wasn't done yet. Years later, Jasmine Carter sat in the executive office of Hayes Technologies, her name engraved on the door as Vice President of Corporate Strategy. What had started as a job had become a mission. Under her leadership, the company expanded its ethical labor initiatives, launched mentorship programs, and built partnerships with minority-owned businesses. And across town, a new community center stood tall, bearing the name Brooks, Hayes Foundation, funding education and job opportunities for underserved youth. At its ribbon-cutting ceremony, Ethan, now a college freshman, stood beside her, grinning like the kid who once got a free meal in a diner. because kindness, that was the kind of investment that always paid off. Lessons from the story. This story is a testament to the power of kindness, resilience, and knowing your worth. Jasmine never set out to change her life that night at the diner. She simply chose to help a boy in need. But that single act of compassion led her down a path that tested her strength, challenged her limits, and ultimately reshaped her future. One of the greatest lessons here is that opportunities often come disguised as challenges. Jasmine could have backed down when she was framed, when she was doubted, when powerful people tried to push her out. Instead, she stood her ground, proving that no one, not wealth, not status, gets to decide her value except for her. It also reminds us that loyalty and power can be deceiving. Nick had built an empire, but even he was blind to the betrayal happening within his own walls. Trust is important, but blind trust, that's dangerous. Jasmine's ability to see people for who they really were, both good and bad, was what ultimately made her indispensable. And finally, success isn't just about winning. It's about lifting others up with you. Jasmine didn't just climb to the top. She made sure the door stayed open for others to follow. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful lesson.